You're listening to Catholic Family Podcast, Episode 28.
I'm Kevin Davis. Thanks again for joining the show. I'm joined yet again by my parents, Dan and Lisa, and we're going to talk again. This is part 2 of a show talking about how kids should behave in church and how we get them to do so and how we get them to be well behaved in church. And before we get started, I would like to say please like, subscribe, and comment on this if you have any questions, suggestions, or your own opinions. It helps to spread this. We're not making any money from it, but we do want to get out good media. That's the whole purpose of this podcast, is to get more good stuff out there on the internet, because the internet is totally jam-packed with a bunch of garbage. So please share, like, subscribe. We're really trying to do our best we can here, and that definitely helps in trying to share the little bit of content that we provide. So, Mom and Dad, I think today we want to talk about the nuts and bolts, and I guess to get right into that, we're going to talk about the age in our opinions. Again, I should say, part 2, I should say again, this is just our opinions. We're not experts. If anyone has any issues, talk to a priest. And we're not trying to poke at anyone. We're not trying to make anyone feel bad. This is just how we feel about it and how we think things should be, just our opinion. So please, let's start, I guess, Mom and Dad, with what's the right age for kids, in your opinion, to start going to church?
Well, what we did was by 4 years old, you got to go to church. It was not you had to go to church. You got to go to church at 4 years old. We actually lived, when you were children, the first four of you, we lived within 5 minutes of the church for a long time. And it was a beautiful, wonderful thing to be able to switch masses. So one parent went to the 8, one parent went to the 10, and whoever wasn't at mass stayed home with the babies. And that was actually ideal, because then both parents actually got to really pay attention to mass. That was a wonderful thing. Now, that most of our lives we were not able to do that, but so
I would actually step back just a minute from that and say that as a newborn, as you know, a baby, an infant, a year-old, there are sights, there are sounds, there are smells that I think you want to have kind of imprinted on them, and so it's good to just have them in that environment, just because I think that there's a certain amount of familiarity. Right. That they're not going to benefit from the mass. I mean, not in a spiritual sense, but I mean, I do think that there are certain just experiences, sensory experiences that they can develop, right. And it's a good thing to have them there, right. Starting very, very young.
But they do not have to be there every Sunday. And take it from a mom who held babies for 30 or 20 years. Having a break from that and being able to switch masses is a beautiful thing.
Beautiful thing, yeah.
And you are not required as an infant, 2-year-old, or even a 3-year-old to be there. I mean, it is a good thing, like Dad said, it totally is. And but yeah, when you have an infant who's crying the whole time, you know, they're not experiencing mass at all, you know, and you don't want to create a Pavlovian response in your child that mass is a terrible, horrible thing, and you know they hate it. So, you know, and we have said many times, and I think we've already touched on this in another podcast, that, you know, you should take the child out in the vestibule. You should take your child, if your child, the first noise they make, goes immediately out. And you will train your child, the youngest baby, you train them not to be noisy. Now we've got how old is Chloe? She's 4 months old. Mm. And she babbles and babbles and babbles, and she's adorable and very distracting to everybody around her, and her mother too, because, you know, her mom feels, you know, you feel like everybody's looking at you, and sometimes they are and shouldn't be, but you can't help it if you got a cute baby, right? So that's why, you know, we're very blessed to have a cry room, or, you know, if you've got a vestibule, you may spend a lot of your motherhood standing out in the vestibule so that you don't have a crying baby in church. But I have been assured by my pastor, and if you're not sure, ask your pastor, that you have fulfilled your Sunday obligation, even if you're outside in the vestibule with the baby, that you don't need to worry about that. You're not missing mass. You do the best you can to be, you know, mindful of the mass and of our Lord. But it's, if you are in the church with a crying baby, or even a constantly babbling baby, you're not really paying attention at all, and neither is anybody else around you. So, you do yourself a favor, you do the people around you a favor, you do the priest a favor, and you actually are doing your child a favor to take them out immediately, so that they learn, it just at a very basic level, that kind of noise making is not appropriate in Mass.
And one of the practices we had it was hard. It was hard for us, especially as we got a little bit older, was when they are a year, 18 months, and they're not to the point where they can sit still, they can kneel, they can stand, they can just be quiet. We held them the entire time. You just don't put them down. We just did not put that. No. So I think that was one of our practices, was we were particularly conservative about how mature they needed to be before they could actually sit. You could actually sit on your own in Mass. And I would say,
well, that was considered a privilege to get to be out of mom and dad's arms in Mass. Right. And that's usually 2 to 3. Yeah. And then, you train bit by bit. And this does not happen overnight. By about 3 years old, most children can be trained to sit fairly still, not crawling all over the pew, not underneath the kneelers, not turning around staring at the people behind them. Thank you very much. They're so adorable, but boy, is that distracting. By 3 years old, you should be able to sit fairly still and face forward in your pew. And this is our most volatile, tactile children. By 3 years old, you got to keep on them, and it doesn't happen overnight, but you can train them by 3 years old to be decent. By 4 years old, they should have it down, and you should be able to, for the most part, be able to trust them to sit quietly in the pew, and to learn too that when the people behind you are kneeling forward, you lean forward to get out of their way so that their hands can rest on the back of the pew. And that, you're not distracting them that way too. And
for us, 4 years old was a big line in the sand. And what we called it a minute ago, we were talking about this and said it was kind of the age of awareness, where a 4-year-old is very much aware of their surroundings. And so what you can do, I mean, we had, like Mom said, we had the grace of being able to split Masses. So as a 3.5-year-old, what we did with several of you was to not allow you to go to Mass from about 3.5 to about 4. And then when you turn 4, now you start playing the mind games, right? You get to go to Mass. It's a 4-year-old is such a big boy, such a big girl, and you get to go to Mass every single week, and it's such a privilege.
4 years old was a big birthday.
4 years old was a big birthday, because at that point, and now they're excited, they're grown up in their minds, they're 4 years old. And now they can go to Mass and actually participate and be there. They don't really know what's going on, but they can sit quietly and be good. So
and then when they do sit quietly, you praise them up, down one side and down the other, and you tell them, see, now you have to behave in Mass so that your little sister, your little brother are watching you, and you need to show them how to behave during Mass. And feeling like a big kid is a big deal to a 4-year-old. So it's a very effective way of training them. But you gotta, it's gotta be constant. It can't be Sunday morning. You talk about this through the week too.
Well, I think there are two really, really big points that I want to talk about real quickly. Is that one is that these kids before the age of reason, I mean, certainly before the age of 4, they are, if they are baptized, they are in the state of grace. So they don't acquire more grace from being there, because they're not aware of it, that they're not participating in it. They're just there. They don't need it. They go straight to heaven if they die. So I think and I'm not a theologian. So please, if any priest is listening, tell me if I'm wrong. That's my interpretation of it. So you don't pile on graces just because the child is at church. So then the question becomes, do you want them to become used to it and to be, I guess not understand it, but to be, to realize kind of what it is as you're kind of growing up as a child.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that's your opportunity to train. I mean, that's what we used it for. For us, between about 3 and especially after 4, and between 4 and Holy Communion, those are really important training years. And that's not just for religiously, that's in everything. You learn so much between those ages, and so much of your your future brain activity starts at those ages. It's incredibly important time.
Yeah, the ages of about 4 to about 11 or so, pre-puberty, they're wonderful years. The children basically they're in control of themselves to a certain degree. They're learning the world. They're easy to please. They're not moody. And there's so much that's so wonderful about those ages, but those are also the pivotal ages where you've got to get it right as a parent, and you've got to reinforce the good habits, because if you have not established all of these good habits and done things right in those magical ages from 4 to 11, you're not, I mean, you got a little bit of influence by the time they hit teenage years, but by that time the die is cast, and you have a very, very difficult time getting
hard.
back.
It can be done, but it's much harder. It's better to take care of all the problems before they happen, nip it all in the bud and train them. And it's, how do you train someone to love? And what you're doing is you want them to learn to love God. You want them to learn to love their faith. And how you handle it, it's so important to teach reverence and piety at these ages, and love truly. You say over and over again, when they're little, look at this beautiful day that God gave us. See how much he loves us? I mean, you say things like that so that they start to understand love. They learn love through you, or they learn not to love through you. So if you teach them to love God and to understand that he loves you, then that transfers into behavior and in mass and everywhere else too, that you do these things out of love for God. And if you have a good relationship with your child, they want to please you because they know how much you love them too. And sometimes all it takes anymore is just, you give them the look and you look a little disappointed, and it breaks their little hearts, and they want to please you. And they need to feel that look of disappointment from the tabernacle, that if they are behaving in mass, that it pleases our Lord so much. And you need to tell them this, and not just on Sunday morning. And that if they are misbehaving, that our Lord is looking down on them with disappointment. And nobody wants to disappoint someone who loves them so much, and then that's how you learn to teach them love. They're not going to get that without you teaching them. I mean, very, very rarely does that come without parents' involvement, and all, every day, not just Sunday morning.
Right. And it also obviously affects them with discipline as well, right? And I know we talked about it in a previous podcast too, that you don't go out and you don't spank them and whip them because they're being bad, because that gives them a bad image of being in church. And this is a really important topic that we talked about again previously at some point, that we talked about, if you're at home even and you try to sit in one spot for an hour and a half or 2 hours and not to move, and the kid's not going to move or make any noise, it's simply impossible. It never happens. I mean, we have Sophia, who's now 15 months, and there's no chance. It just cannot happen. And so I think that's important to remember. That's like, this isn't unusual, but I think it's also important. And so obviously, but you also, if they misbehave, you got to take them out. But I think it's so important to touch on again the importance of us as parishioners, that we have to care for the people around us. And I know Bishop Ivernus mentioned at several occasions, and he wasn't even talking about babies. He was talking about people coughing. And he was saying, if you have a serious cough and you're constantly coughing or sneezing or sniffing, leave the church. You are distracting other people, and you're taking away from the graces that they can get. And I think, I'm not positive he said this, but I think you can be potentially causing an occasion of sin. You can cause someone else to have frustration or anger. So this is how important this is. I mean, this is not just a throwaway deal because you don't mind that the kids are screaming, and it's not a big deal to you if other kids are screaming, but maybe it is to somebody. And you have to always assume that somebody else in that chapel is getting frustrated or angry because of your baby. And that's a really big deal.
Yeah, we had close to zero tolerance in terms of the babies making noise. So even if one was in a baby carrier, in a car seat and woke up and just started cooing.
Quiet cooing, I don't take them out. I mean,
well,
when it becomes a distraction.
And so
right.
And then you just and no punishment. You're not upset. You just take them out and no
big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it becomes automatic. I mean,
but it's super hard. It's like today I had Sophia, and she was being super good and super cute. and she just kept saying, "Mama, mama, mama," but in a very nice, very cute way. But it's like for me, it's like, okay, it's no problem. She's not causing any trouble. But I mean, maybe father, for goodness sake. That I haven't even mentioned the priest. I mean, I know, Dad, you've served plenty of times at the mass, and when you're even just a server, as a server, I can't handle it. I can't handle other noises behind me. So I can't, and I think part of it is because the devil amplifies the noise towards you. I think that's just how it works. And I can't even imagine then what the priest is going through. I mean, imagine the temptations and the issues he's having with concentration because of some cooing baby. It's that important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, one of the most important things you can teach your children just in general is courtesy and respect. And that is courtesy and respect you are teaching it to your youngest children, and the people around you will be very grateful. And not to mention, of course, the priest. I mean, you can't be too kind to other people around you, especially in mass. But I figure we probably ought to go to some very, very basics here.
Yeah, and talk about how do you, with the older children, the biggest problem with older children is getting up and leaving during mass, and that can so easily becomes its own distraction. Right. And I think that there's some practical advice to stop that. And grown-ups too.
It's so distracting to everybody around you for getting up, getting down, getting up, getting down. There are a lot of things that are just basic. I'm going to give you a basic outline of our rules. Okay, we get up early. We'd get to mass in time for everybody to go to the bathroom.
Yes.
If you are over 7 or 8 years old and you don't know to do that yourself, well, mom's going to make sure you do that yourself. And especially toddlers, unless you have somebody who's potty trainers, that's a little bit of a different thing. But they don't get up to go to the bathroom. If you're going to throw up, well, yes, obviously you get up and go. But you learn to read your children's cues. You know when they're just trying to pull something over on you, and they will try to pull it over on you. But you make it a hard and fast rule. We go to the bathroom before mass. And we do not leave during mass unless you are going to die. It's non-communicants. We feed before mass. There is absolutely no reason for them to fast. And if they do fast, they're going to be cranky and miserable and irritable and crying.
And that's an easy one to forget because you're fasting and your older children are fasting. And if you all of a sudden, force a little one to miss breakfast, that's
you're going to have trouble.
Yeah.
And, we always had a long ways to go. So we would have, don't give them sugar, for crying out loud. Don't give them sugar. And some kids are very, very susceptible to, sugar. We would give them a bag of Cheerios and they would nibble on the Cheerios on the way to church. Do not, please, I beg of you, do not bring food into the church, except for a bottle for the children. All you're doing is teaching your child a habit that you are going to have to break later, not to mention the fact that it leaves a mess and it's really kind of disrespectful.
And it creates scandal. I mean, there are those who will see children eating in mass and it'll be a distraction. They won't be able to concentrate on mass.
Exactly. And that's something that mom and dad should have the wherewithal to take care of before mass. Feed the child, just feed them. And bottles, of course, obviously bottles are not going to be a problem. Be very careful about where you place your children now this is an obvious thing. Most parents know that child A and child B should not be seated together, but sometimes in the general confusion of loading into the pew, you might need to make adjustments because there are certain children that should not sit next to other children. There are certain children that if they're placed behind a school buddy right in front of them need to be moved to. And this is just something basic parenting. You're just kind of watching for these things on a Sunday morning. It should be on your checklist.
I don't know if Dominic and Michelle are listening, but I think they would probably still misbehave if they knelt next to each other in church.
We don't let them sit near we've talked about this before in just general child rearing. Talk about, you've got your music playing beforehand and you talk to your children and you tell them your expectations every Sunday. Don't think that you ever don't do it. Tell them your expectations before mass. You say it out loud. It should almost be like a mantra. This is how we expect you to behave today. We expect you to be good, and we know you can do it. And if you behave yourselves, you get a donut after mass because bribery talks. And if you aren't good, and then if they aren't good, they don't get the donut. I mean, you really do have to stick to your guns that way because they'll use you. They will totally use you.
And another one that I would put out there is that if mom and dad, especially, are mad at each other, suck it up and make you've got to make Mass, you got to make Rosary a happy place where there is no conflict, and no matter how much you have to pretend everything is okay.
We're never mad at each other.
Yeah, have that. If you're going to have the fight or you're going to have harsh words for each other or whatever, do it when you need to do it, but keep it out of the context of Mass and of holy, holy things like the Rosary.
Right. I mean, and then there's a certain level of, formality that does need obviously to be held up. But I have to say that one of the best moments of my entire life, my dad was a very, very strict guy, and he would gather us all together for the Rosary, and you had to even pronounce your words properly. You had to. I mean, my dad was a stickler, a Navy man, right? And so we were all a little bit of afraid of the Rosary, actually. And then there was one day when my baby brother fell off the couch in such a way that he did a complete flip and landed on his butt. And my dad started laughing and laughing and laughing to the point that he couldn't finish the Rosary. And we had to break for 20 minutes and then come back and finish the Rosary.
We did that a few times too.
Yes, we did. And then that's, what? Sometimes it's a really good thing.
It's okay. Yeah.
That, you don't ever want your children to get the idea that there is no joy in religion because there's a lot of joy in religion, and probably God was laughing at that flip too, but just to say that there should never be moments of hilarity in the Mass, in the church. If something like that happens, and you know what, sometimes it does, you got to train your children, get up, go out, compose yourself, and come back, and then be careful they don't use that, because then they'll try to use that. Boy, kids are sneaky, and they will use you. They will try to get out of things. But I'm trying to think if there's any other. Oh, okay. So there's certain things. All right, this is a little trick of ours, and I know that not everybody would want to do it, but it worked very, very well for us. When our children were about between 4 and 5 years old, they were required to fold their hands when they were in the pew or hold their missal. And then we had a lot of little children's missals and saint books and things like that. And if they were not folding their hands, they had to hold their missal. If they weren't holding the missal, they had to fold their hands. And it went a long way towards stopping fidgeting. And almost nobody liked to fold their hands, so they held their missal, which is exactly what I wanted them to do, because you do need to train your children to use their missal. When you grow up and you are able to attend Mass and pay attention and contemplate without your missal, that's a wonderful thing. That's a wonderful goal. But when you're under the age of, most people under the age of 20 maybe, you really do need your missal to keep your brain on the Mass. I mean, most people do, and especially children under 12 really do need to learn how to follow the missal. And that's sort of basic.
And we had a special grace, I think, or a special blessing, whatever you're going to call it, where our oldest son, your brother Paul, was an absolute master of self-restraint, even as a child, as a 4 or 5 year old. And so he picked up on kneeling properly and folding his hands properly and reading the missal properly and all that. And he set a perfect example for all of the rest of you, so that when it came time that you had to learn to have the proper comportment in Mass, you just had it. You just had it. But I mean, it might be a challenge for you, Kevin, where, Sophia may or may not have that same discipline like Paul did, but I think it's going to be particularly important that you help her set the standard that the older ones can look up to.
Right. It's very often that your first 2 practice pancakes are so important, because they do set the scene for everybody following. A lot of their hardest work is with the first 2 kids. And then afterwards, it actually in some ways can be easier if the first 2 or 3 set the scene for everybody else. And kind of, you guys were the heavies that if mom and dad didn't catch it, you or Paul did. Mm-hmm. We talked about not leaving church. It's very important to me to teach children at the youngest age to face forward. I was sitting with a 3 and 4-year-old granddaughters yesterday at Mass, and it's a very easy thing. All you do is you put your hand on their head and you just turn their head forward. You don't even need to say anything. And if they look at you out of the corner of your eye, you wink at them and smile, and you point it up at Jesus. And it's not a hard thing to do, but it's something that you have to constantly do and train them to face forward. So it's very distracting to the people behind you when they're turned around, staring at them. And that's something that's not that hard, but it just takes a lot of perseverance.
And in those little battles, I mean, what you find is if you constantly win those little battles, like their heads turning and getting their heads turned correctly, you don't end up typically having to take on the big battles,
right?
Yeah. And basically they'll learn and they'll self-adjust themselves.
Right. And then afterwards, when they've been good, whisper in their ear that you're so proud of them for being so good for Jesus. And look how I know that Jesus is just looking down there at you, just probably even hugging you right now. And little ones respond to that extremely well. And they remember that and they want to please. I think that it's we are all damaged by original sin, but I think there is still that instinct in all of us to want to be loved and to respond well and to try to please in this way. And then it's not that hard to elicit it in church.
Right. And as we all know, kids and everyone they actually want authority. I mean, on the surface, they don't, and they want to act out, but they don't want to just be on their own. They want to be told what to do, and they want to be given a form of how to live. I mean, that's why we're here. That's why kids have parents. They don't just sprout from the ground. And God made this all for a reason. There's a reason for everything, and part of why there are parents, obviously, is to raise the kids, to teach them how to act. And I think that if there's anything that I take from all of it, is that you can do it. You can get your kids to behave in church, and it's infinitely important to do so. And the last podcast I did with Father Benedict talked about the dignity of the Mass. And I love the word, the dignity of the Mass. I mean, it is a dignified event. And I think that's something that, the Novus Ordo has taken away, and that the modern world doesn't have dignity in anything. And that's the beauty of it. We have that beautiful dignity, and we have to play our part. And our part as parents is to make sure, literally, that we are part of the dignity of that and making sure there aren't crying kids in the church.
All right, we are passing along the greatest gift that God has given us in the Mass from one generation to the next, and it's under such assault these days that I mean, it's particularly important that we do it. But there's no greater treasure and there's no greater responsibility that we could have.
Mm-hmm.
No, exactly. No, I think that's a good place to end. Do you guys have any last words or last advices for especially our young parents out there?
Don't be discouraged.
Right.
The early years, it's just constant. I mean, but you will get through it. I promise.
Right.
I mean, you will get through it. And see, now we get to sit behind our grandchildren in Mass and watch Michelle do the exact same thing I used to do. Just tap the back of a head. It's like, yeah, hey, I don't even have to do it. I get to watch it being carried on. It's a beautiful thing, but it's worth it. It's very worth it to have gone through those first hard years of not putting down those toddlers until they were ready to be put down. And now look at you, you're doing the same thing, and you're training your own children, and it's a wonderful thing to pass along.
Yep. And remember that our Lord himself, even talking about our salvation, said that the key to it is perseverance. And that's, I think, the key thing. If you have a bad day and things aren't going well, you've got to just persevere. You got to fight through it. You got to figure out what you're doing wrong.
Mm-hmm.
You got to do it better next time. And even if you're, trending down, you just keep at it.
Right. Drop back 10 and punt, figure it out. Your children need to know when you are displeased, but it's more important to teach them to love, to learn out of love. But then they also need to sometimes, they need to know when they're not acting properly too. However, never in the church building. Take them out, separate them from the church building to correct them. But yeah, I think we've already gone over that.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Well, I think it's a good place to end. And I think that, Mom, you have a really nice blog that you wrote a couple years ago that I'll share. That's really got a lot of the ideas from this show are in written form and much longer. I think it's very in-depth, and I think a very nice and well regarded post on your blog, and I'll attach that to this show. If anyone has any comments or has any questions for my parents about how kids should act, obviously, again, if you have any direct questions, of course, ask your priest and ask a pastor. Again, we're not experts. This is just opinions and based on how they've raised their own kids. But if you want to ask them something, something personal, maybe something that you don't feel comfortable asking a priest, go ahead and send it to me at my email, kevin89davis@gmail.com. I will forward it on to them. I'm absolutely certain they'll be happy to answer any of your questions that you might have regarding how to, have your kids behave well in church. Mom and Dad, thank you very much for coming on. And I'm sure, again, we'll have some other conversation come up again. And until then, God bless.
God bless. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Kevin.
You've been listening to the Catholic Family Podcast. If you enjoyed this show, please share it with your friends and family. You can support the production on Patreon and PayPal, and you can reach Kevin at kevin89davis@gmail.com. Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam, all for the greater glory of God.